All right, my gently used beautiful humans, buckle up because today's episode is one for the books. We're diving deep into the ways we get tangled into the invisible strings of culture, power, and identity. And who better to help us unravel it than the brilliant Elise Loehnen? Elise is a writer, editor, and thought leader who isn't afraid to question the status quo. You may know her as the former chief content officer at Goop, where she helped shape the modern wellness conversation, or as New York Times bestselling author of On Our Best Behavior, a book that rips the curtain back on the subconscious rules governing all of us. She's been featured on countless platforms, but today she's here with us ready to explore the deep-seated patterns that shape us and how we can finally break free of them. So if you've ever found yourself stuck in a story that wasn't yours to begin with, or if you're ready to rewrite the rules in a way that actually serves you, this conversation is definitely for you. So let's get into it. This is The Gently Used Human with Elise Loehnen. Elise, welcome to The Gently Used Human. What a pleasure to have you.
Likewise. Thrilled.
I have a feeling we're going to have some nerd out conversation on one of my favorite subjects, which is the deconstruction of the status quo. And tasty. And what I mean by that, for those who are like, okay, we just started and what the fuck is he talking about? I mean, like, the ways we get into these deep-seated patterns, these ways culturally, individually, as groups, that we get into this way of being that we don't really know anything different than that status quo. And I love the process of deconstructing that, of how do we unknow or unlearn these grooved patterns and really get to, like, where do we actually have fucking choice again? And agency. Does that sound like a fun place for you?
That sounds like an amazing place to start, which has implications both in our personal lives and in the greater world as well. Yeah. Because deconstruction is so important to building something new and creating new ways of being in the world. It's also terrifying and can feel incredibly destabilizing and uncertain. And so many of us, even if the status quo isn't working for us, would prefer the status quo, right? To having to do things differently.
Oh, yeah. We'll always pick the familiar hell over like a new pathway that might just be like, and that exhale we've been waiting for.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel that acutely all the time. And I think change only really happens when you get to the point, I mean, you know this better than I do, of feeling like whatever you have been doing is intolerable to you, it is boring, it is tedious, and it is too painful to stay where you are.
Yeah. And usually at that point where we're just like defeated, we don't really have the energy reserves to be like, to put that into the change process, which requires more energy for change than it does to sustain that status quo or that pattern or that thing that's not really letting us feel optimal.
Yeah. What's interesting, you sort of touched on this in your opening salvo, is that often, and this is why I think we have sometimes much greater perspective on other people's lives and our friends' lives. Like, we can see what they're up to. They just cannot see what they're up to, right? But when we're talking about big cultural patterns, which is one of my favorite things to talk about and write about, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And it feels so incredibly obvious. In the same way, watching your friend get into the same compulsive, repetitive, romantic relationship with different people over and over again is so obvious. But I think the same thing happens on culture, where if you can get enough perspective, you're like, duh, how did I not see that this is the operating manual that's holding me by my throat?
Yeah. And then you're in the matrix phenomenon, which is like you've broken through the coding that has kept you in the veil of awareness. And then you're like, oh shit, I'm alone in this? Maybe. Yeah. I mean, or there's a select few who've broken through. But it's also, that's its own pain.
Yeah, it's true. And again, sometimes you're like, let me just go back to sleep because
Oh my gosh. I want to go back to the Matrix, basically. Please let me back in. I will take blue, red, whatever fucking pill you need right now to reprieve the pressure and the ache of going, what the hell is going on? And I'm seeing what is going on and the reasons why.
Yes, it's painful. And it's, as we all know, and as we live every day, it's far more complicated. And there are people who are implicated in it that you're like, I don't want you to be implicated. It's also, you want to choose your villains and pick the story that feels most comfortable and familiar. And instead, as we do this work, we find it's very complicated and nuanced, and people are really complex too, and full of wonderful qualities and full of bad qualities. And that's what makes us human.
Yeah. I will say, like, that to me is an indicator when it's all or nothing thinking, when we go, oh, that friend is amazing, or that ex is a monster. And there's no nuance of the human condition or experience in that. That lets me know I am stuck in something that I have not really gotten to the heart of, or I am stuck in something or a way of seeing that doesn't allow me to see the full spectrum of life and experience. And maybe I'll just give a nerdy science example because, damn, those just turned me on. You know that study that came out, I'm pretty sure it was Harvard, though it might have been some other Ivy League, some
fancy pedigreed school. Yeah.
Some pedigree school that did not accept me. But here we are. I'm not bitter. It was the cat study. So the famous cat study, which is they put newborn kittens, yeah, into a room that only had painted lines that were horizontal. And then they had a second room where they put the other kittens in a room with lines that were only vertical. So they came to understand the world as either horizontal or vertical separately. After the maturation time where they really got acclimated to, like, this is how the world exists, this is how the world is, they put the cats in the other room. So they did a little switcheroony, and the cats ran into the walls because they couldn't make and organize and understand that the world existed. They couldn't actually see anything besides what they knew. There's like an old narrative, I don't know if it's true because I wasn't around then, that when like Columbus came over, that the indigenous folks of North America specifically couldn't see the boats because they had not ever seen anything that existed in that paradigm. I don't know if that one's true. I wasn't around. I'm not, historians questionable around that period of time. But it's this thing about it's hard to deconstruct when we have been accustomed to and acclimated to a very vertical or horizontal world where that's all we know.
And of course, we have all sorts of biases where we want to see or perceive the world in a certain way that it's much more convenient, much more familiar, certainly much tidier. I mean, the science is that we actually do a lot better with complexity and nuance.
Yeah.
However, we're built to sort of categorize and code and make very fast and quick assumptions based on our previous history. And when we can't reconcile something, we discard it, particularly at the pace at which the world is moving. This is how we make ourselves feel safe and centered.
I just want to even name some of those biases, like confirmation bias, just so we have those words out there, or transference, or sibling transference. For like the moment you came on, Elise, and I see you, I'm like, oh, you remind me of my friend Nikki. And already, hi Nikki. I wonder if she's ever listened. I won't ask her. It's awkward. But, the moment I go, okay, this person reminds me of Nikki, I start looking for the attributes in this other individual that is familiar. And I'm primarily looking for that. And I'm not looking for the things that set you apart. And my voice, this is what I loved in the research. My voice, my vocal tone changes to meet you in the way that I would speak to my friend Nikki, not to a new stranger. And then you start to behave in response to how I'm treating you. And it becomes either more familiar or sets you very much apart. But oftentimes you'll start to act in certain ways that will confirm you are like my friend Nikki, and that's why I'm treating you as such. And the closeness or proximity that might just organically form.
Right. No, it makes complete sense to me.
We're so hard to deconstruct.
Yeah. And it's hard too, because, you know, this book on our best behavior that I wrote, that came out almost 2 years ago at this point, which is wild. But it is about patriarchy in some ways, which makes it sound more tedious and boring than it is. I promise it's a really fun read. But it's more specifically about our internalized patriarchy and putting ourselves in the center of a system that we can profess to hate, but that we also maintain and police ourselves according to its edicts and police each other. So it's about sort of the self-sustaining mechanism of patriarchy, because to undo it would require acknowledging, oh, well, I'm actually fully participating in this, sometimes benefiting from it, often struggling under it. But we all, not just me, but we all have to take responsibility for our reality, rather than saying it's the men, it's this person, it's Mitt Romney, whomever it is.
It's definitely Mitt Romney.
It's definitely Mitt Romney. But I mean, that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book, is because when I would talk to people, they would say things like they would talk about the patriarchy as like a boogeyman, the patriarchy. And it's like, who is the patriarchy?
What is this patriarchy I hear so much about?
Yeah, but when you start actually thinking about how you're talking about it, it's like, well, what is it? When did it start? Is it Mitt Romney behind a curtain like Frank Oz? Like, what is it? And it was only through that process that I came to understand, it's a system that has no sort of key author or key promoter. It's just the thing that we continually maintain by virtue of participating in it, maintaining it, and acting it out, because we're not conscious of the way in which it informs how we behave.
Now, I know, because I've seen it online. I've seen friends have an experience where they say the word patriarchy, and you have kind of two polar responses. One is, hell yeah, fuck the patriarchy. I'm all for that. And why are you hating men?
Right.
And I'm like, again, we're missing the nuance in the material.
Point.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how do we bring people back to the Goldilocks middle chair of patriarchy?
Yes. Well, so first, I think what's really important too, these are the words, and which I'm going to butcher slightly, of this man, John Powell, who runs like the Center of Othering. And he says something along the lines of, we need to be better at being really hard on systems and soft on people. And we are really good at being hard on people and soft on systems. So first of all, patriarchy is a system. It's a system that we inherited. It's not the way that it's always been. It's quite old, but it's really not very old considering how long we've been walking this planet. Again, patriarchy, it is men on top, specifically white men, white straight men, and everyone else below them. Patriarchy comes from pater, it comes from father. And so it would presume to privilege white straight men. Sure. However, I think we all know that patriarchy is one of those, it's a little bit like late stage capitalism. It sure is teetery-tottery right now. And it's also very clear that it hurts all of us, and in many ways is more wounding to men than women. Women have learned in many ways to survive, if not thrive, in this world that's not built for us. Whereas when you look at, and again, I'm not talking about sort of the oligarchy and the techno billionaires who are trying to take over our government right now. I'm talking about white working class men who are potentially swept up in supporting those tech billionaires, but who are inordinately more addicted, dying from deaths of despair, much higher rates of suicide. These wounded boys have become wounding men who are creating a lot of havoc in our culture, whereas you just don't see the same thing. Women are not necessarily off the hook, but we are not gunning each other down at school. We're not creating the same type of cultural havoc. And it's not because we don't also have access to guns. It's because for whatever reason, we're a little bit more sound mentally. And I think it's partly because, and this is the main
I'm just going to
thesis.
pause here because I can just imagine if you're an individual listening to this, a human being, and going either, oh, damn. Because I had a moment where I was like, I never really quite conceptualized that there's very little of the mass shootings, especially in schools, that have been cis female.
Very, very,
or female.
Very rare. I think there was one recently, which was kind of shocking because it doesn't really happen.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I have so many friends that have this moment when they hear this material and they go into a freeze response. And I just want to name that. So if you're listening to this, whether you're a white male or just any human being of any gender, and you're like, I'm having this freeze response, I think it's helpful to go, is there shame here? Mm-hmm. Is part of the freeze, and shame is biologically a freeze response, so that we can pause and evaluate. Oftentimes in that freeze or that shame response, we start to turn it towards ourselves or go, fuck this person who's saying these things, and project it on them. I'm going to invite you to once again find the middle seat of the Goldilocks situation and go, oh, what else is happening in me? Or what happened just before the freeze? Is it a feeling of discomfort? Is it a feeling of anger? Is it a feeling of sadness? So that we can attend to that, so that you can turn back into this material that's really important and truly understand we're not talking about you, the individual. We're talking about a system that you exist in. Yes,
that you didn't choose. We don't get to select. I mean, maybe we do on some cosmic spiritual level.
Sure.
But most, you are born how you are born into the circumstances of your birth, right? And as we know, some people are more vulnerable than others, depending on various factors. Yeah. But I would say, one of the main theses of the book is that women within a patriarchy are conditioned for goodness. Again, to be a bad woman, a toxic coworker, bad mother, abusive boss, whatever descriptor you want to use is incredibly damning for women. We see evidence of this all over our culture, whether it's female founders who are exiting stage right, or it's celebrities like Blake Lively. All you have to do is say a woman is bad in some way and she is done. Meanwhile, it doesn't matter. Men can behave in terrible, reprehensible, convictable ways, and we don't care because men are conditioned for power. The only thing that's problem for men in our culture is if we perceive them as weak, feminine, and so on and so forth. So this is like the main construct. Yeah. Men are not allowed to be weak, which means, I think, being in touch with their emotions, letting themselves feel their full feminine, archetypal feminine qualities. I'm not talking about gender. I'm just talking about all the parts of ourselves that are sort of in the Jungian concept, loving, nurturing, creative, internal, so on and so forth. And women, meanwhile, are not allowed to misbehave, or someone is there. We're either policing ourselves or we're policing each other, often more stridently and more insistently than men. We are, in many ways, our own worst nightmare. It's hard to say that when it's so much easier to say, well, it's the men. Sure, it's some men, but I've also experienced, I mean, I have 2 male sons. I'm married to a feminist man. I have an older gay brother. I've been mentored by many incredible men. And I've been mentored by some women. I've also been persecuted by women. And I've met some real ass fucks too. Sorry, in the male sphere. I've been sexually harassed. I mean, every woman has their stories.
Yeah.
So it's not so simple. It's not so simple to say like those people bad, these people good. Those people villains, these people victims. Those people are oppressors, these people are oppressed. No perfect victims here.
No. And I think if we go back to the cats for a moment, because I love them cats.
I do too. I have a cat in my lap.
I saw that. I was like, perfect timing.
I have my 3-legged cat over there who will soon attack my other cat. I have a lot of cats, Scott.
There's some drama over there in Catland. Okay. The cats grew up with those horizontal lines of paint. And they say to the other cats, this is all there is. This is how it should be. It's like if we grew up in a system, a patriarchal system that created these ideologies, these beliefs, this concept of like, you need to be a good woman. Other women, as you talk about in your book and your work, are going to participate in that because they are replicating and informing you of the system they internalized.
Yeah. And there's a lot, and this is, so for people who are listening, the book is set up, and this is kind of odd. And I, just for context, my father's Jewish. My mom calls herself a recovering Catholic. And I grew up in a very unaffiliated way. I didn't go to church. I didn't read the Bible. I'm a deeply spiritual person now, still unaffiliated. But the construct of the book is the 7 deadly sins, using those as a punch card and an organizing principle for what it is to be a good woman. And there's like a very fascinating history, which I get into in the book, about why women and where the 7 deadly sins came from, because they weren't actually in the Bible. But just to remind, they weren't.
Where did they come from?
Isn't that crazy?
I was going to ask you that because I couldn't remember. Like, because I also have never read the Bible. I mean, I perused it, Cliff Notes, but ChatGPT'd it once. But where did they come from?
Yeah. So isn't that wild that they're not in the Bible? Because I assumed, of course, I was like, where's the chapter and verse? Let me go and understand the original context. No.
Isn't most of the the punishment, the fear-based work actually post-Bible anyways?
Yeah, I mean, some Old Testament, in the Torah, God is pretty scary. But yes, most of our understanding of the Bible comes from the way that it's been interpreted and passed down and whispered into our ears. So this is a perfect example, right? So people hear the 7 deadly sins. They might think of the movie Seven. I understand that was my first instinct as well. And if they're Catholic, they definitely think about sort of Sunday school. But the sins as a set were not in the Bible. So they came out of the Egyptian desert at the hand of this monk named Evagrius Ponticus. And people who love the Enneagram will recognize his name because he's credited as an early father of the Enneagram. And the Enneagram, the 9 points of the Enneagram, are all associated with a vice. And 7 of those vices are the sins. I mean, so they are sloth, pride, envy, greed, gluttony, lust, anger. And so I think anyone listening might be like, oh yeah, those kind of all apply to women in terms of the way that we police ourselves around our appetite, our sexual desire, whether we're allowed to be celebrated and seen, all of these things. Endless doing for other people. So Evagrius Ponticus, who was a wealthy man who'd had an extramarital affair. That's why he decided to go and become sort of an ascetic monk in the desert, as one does. Wrote down, it was called Practicos, and it was this idea of these 8 demonic thoughts. And demon having a different interpretation at the time, being more of a distraction. So these thoughts that would keep you out of prayer. And the 8th was sadness, which I include in the book because I write about it in the context of men. And again, the way that men have been dislocated from their feelings and disallowed from being sad. And sadness is quite feminine, right? It is a passive feeling state, feeling at the effect of the world. We can go there later if you want. But anyway, so he wrote these down. And then with little bits of scripture that you could use against these demonic thoughts. And so he wrote it down in the 4th century. It was passed around to all these desert fathers. There wasn't a lot of written material at the time.
The printing press was a little like on the bricks.
Yeah. Meanwhile, people who have read the New Testament might remember that Mary Magdalene is described a few times in the New Testament as it is now, as the one from whom Jesus cast 7 demons. It's never clarified what they are. Some theologians think that he was balancing her chakras. 7 is obviously a very important number, but there's not much more editorializing other than that. So, and Mary Magdalene, just to go on a bit of a tangent, is... if you've read the Gnostic Gospels or you know anything about Mary Magdalene's gospel, which was deemed heretical and destroyed and then discovered in recent decades, and Dan Brown fans will know all about Mary Magdalene, she wrote this very beautiful gospel. And really, and this is part of the New Testament too, she is the one to whom Jesus resurrects, and he gives her a teaching, which is what the Mary Magdalene's gospel, which was destroyed, is about. This first teaching from a resurrected Christ. She goes back to the other apostles and says, I saw him. He gave me this teaching. This is all recorded in the New Testament as it is now. Peter gets like all in a huff about it. You know, it's like, why would he give it to you? You're a woman, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
The usual.
So that's Mary Magdalene in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. All right. So we have this 8 demonic thoughts roving around the desert like a little newspaper. In 590 AD, so a couple 200 years later, Pope Gregory I gives a homily. And he says in this homily, though these are the 7 cardinal vices, and these are the same demons that Jesus cast out of Mary Magdalene. And Mary Magdalene is the same woman who anoints Jesus's feet with her hair. Different woman, but whatever. Clearly, they're not that interested in the facts. And this woman / Mary Magdalene is a penitent prostitute. So that's where that rumor started. And Pope Gregory also lifted the edict on iconography. There was no iconography, religious art allowed until Pope Gregory said there could be. So you see Mary Magdalene then painted obsessively as this penitent prostitute clinging at Jesus Christ as he ascends. She's dressed in red. And so she wore that reputation until I think it was like 1980 when the papacy said, like, we got that wrong. She wasn't actually a prostitute.
Whoopsie.
And then in 2016, Pope Francis made her the apostle to the apostles. But she was really the first apostle. Sorry, Peter. He gave his first teaching to Mary Magdalene. And so this is where when we go back and we look at history, it's like, oh, things could have been very different.
Yeah.
Very different.
Yeah. My goodness. What do you think would be different? If those horizontal lines of the scarlet
vertical?
letter or the vertical line, you know, whatever, of like demonizing this human being, but specifically demonizing it because she's a woman and you sort of utilize the feminine, where would we be? Yeah.
Isn't that so interesting? And she and Mother Mary are sort of the most prominent women in the Bible, and we turned one of them into the mother and one of them into the whore. But it's interesting how much reverence there is for Mother Mary, like all Notre Dame, like all the major cathedrals are feminine. Like we are desperate for that sort of balance in our world. And I feel like we've all been sort of pushing towards it, even though it's been denied to us, because it feels more accurate and more right. And, Mary Magdalene's gospel, and again, I'm not a theologian, but it's very beautiful because, and a lot of the Gnostic gospels are very beautiful. Gnostic comes from to know, because what he and she are effectively saying is like, the goodness is in you. It cannot be given to you by some outside structure. It's like an internal process, and you have your own relationship with God. Like that's it. It's pretty simple. And that is like a principle where we're not sort of looking to exterior authorities, whether it's priests or parents or professors or bosses, to affirm us and tell us that we're good. It's a very different way to live than to recognize I am innately good. No one can deny that or take that from me. And yes, I'm full of shadow and I'm going to do all sorts of shitty things. And I need to be able to sit with myself and process that and heal myself and restore that innate goodness rather than relying on other people to decide that for you.
Wow, what a different world that would be. I mean, I think in some ways we're in a momentum in the wellness world, and you would also be able to speak to this because I think you helped shape the world of wellness to an
Scott.
degree. Just you.
Gives me a little anxiety. Yeah.
But it's I think it's moved in it, like wellness has extracted itself from a religiousness.
Yes.
Or religionality in the ways of going, actually, you are the healer. Actually, you are the one who does this great work. You are the good, as opposed to the doctors, the psychologists, the sort of medicalized versions of religion.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, too, because when you talk about sort of wellness culture and all of these movements, which are full of light and shadow, right?
Yeah.
And it's impossible to sort of take anything wholesale and say, oh, everything here is good and right, and or everything, nothing's good here. Yeah, there is that idea of restoring balance and homeostasis, and the body is like an incredible healer of itself if we can get out of the way and or let it restore itself to that Goldilocks chair that you keep referencing. And it has this religious connotation, which gets into sort of almost a church-like tradition of like clean, dirty, villain, victim, hero, something needing to be redeemed or saved or cleansed, purified. It's all related in really interesting ways, in ways that I haven't completely identified. But I think it exactly what you said, part of it is like, actually, it's not going to come from out there. And it's going to come from like a sense of wholeness in yourself.
I want to take a moment to give a loud shout out to the Embody Lab, which is one of the most incredible resources for body-based and somatic therapies. This show is all about healing, and the Embody Lab does exactly that. Whether you're on your own journey of transformation and discovery, or enhancing your skill sets in your career as like a coach or a therapist, a body worker, or really any career where you are supporting other gently used humans, the Embody Lab is your place for deep, inspiring, and impactful workshops, certificates, masterclasses, and an incredible community of like-minded folks. I love the Embody Lab, and so do so many other people that call it a platform to come home to over and over again. The Embody Lab is giving my listeners an exclusive offer, a one-time 10% off code to enhance your embodied well-being. All you have to do is go to theembodylab.com and use the code GentlyUse10 at checkout. Yeah. I mean, I think, the easiest example might be like, if any of us who are listening have been like, I'm just waiting for that special other person to complete me.
Yeah.
I really feel like more myself when I'm with someone else. And there is a validity to that. We can use other people as part of our organizing principle. But, however, if we're focusing on other people as the only thing that maybe causes us to love or to feel pain, then we're missing a lot of internal structures, which is like the beauty of like internal family systems work or parts work, as it's also known, to realize how are we also contributing to the feelings, to the experience, to the perceptions, to the reality we're creating. And it's so important to be able to recognize that the world is not happening at us.
Yes.
That we're not being shaped by the world, even though we are in interplay with the systems that we were talking about, like patriarchy, but we are also shaping. We are shaping ourselves. We are shaping the environment we're in, and we just don't always recognize how we're doing it.
Yes, 100%. And yeah, you can see yourself as being sort of at the effect of the world, or you can decide and actually I create my reality in the way that I respond to the world. And I have a lot more power and autonomy in choosing to sort of try to live there rather than feeling like everything is happening to me in a passive state. And same with relationships, right? And I'm certainly guilty of this too. You can either, and we all do this to some extent, you can choose someone or partner with someone who confirms your stories and your general operating system, and you can try together in some ways to move past that. But I adore my husband. I love him deeply. And I love using him as an example because he doesn't listen to anything that I do. Scott, it's wild. He'll be like, I just heard on Armchair Expert, blah, 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 blah. Like, he was amazing. I'm like, I've interviewed that guy 3 times, you dick.
I was with someone who'd never read my books, never. Yeah. So, and there's something refreshing about it, but also like,
he's not interested. I'm like, I can help you. And he is not interested unless it comes from Dax Shepard.
Let's talk about the patriarchy again.
Yeah, exactly. But, I realized in the process of doing this work and then doing work after this book, I have a workbook coming out this summer that I wrote with a coach that gets into a lot of the story creation that we do and then how we use those stories to prop up our identity in ways that are kind of a total waste of time. And one of my stories, Scott, and this comes from the sloth chapter, is I'm the only one who can do it right, so I need to do it all. And that story, underneath that story is a big old fear that I won't be needed and that I'm loved or lovable because I make everything so nice and easy for everyone around me, namely my husband and my children. And should I stop doing all the doing, why would he possibly be with me? Now, keep in mind, there's nothing in Rob that has ever suggested that he sees me as a utility. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
But this is my story. Yeah. And so I will do whatever I can to enact that story to the point of making myself miserable and making myself angry at my husband for not doing more, even though I would never let him do more.
Yeah.
If he doesn't respond to the school in under 90 seconds, then Scott, I'm on it. So I'm just affirming and confirming my own story.
You're affirming your own story. And because other people are in the environment of our story, they are also being shaped. So Rob, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps Rob is not as fast as he might have otherwise been because of that. And then that also confirms the story, but he's also not had this space to really work to exercise the muscle to do more, to step more forward. This is the fucking tricky piece about the environment, like how we shape each other's environments and reaffirm
Yes.
scripts. Yeah.
And learned helplessness all over the place. And I certainly do the same thing to him about certain things where I'm like, I've forgotten how to do yard work. That's for sure. I've forgotten how to reset a router. I mean, to be fair, for context, when I met my husband, who is very technical, I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York City. This is like not that long ago, but like 2010, maybe 2009. And I had 2 Apple routers, but I couldn't figure out how to set them up. And so I had like a 30-foot long Ethernet cable that I just dragged around my apartment. And the first night he came over, he spent the night at my apartment, and he set up all my wireless routers, which was so hot. So when I say I still don't know how to do it, that's not that much of a stretch. But yes, to your point, I don't really give him a chance to take anything off my plate because I'm so scared he will take something off my plate. And now I see what I'm up to. And that's progress.
Yeah, that's amazing. First of all, kudos. That's fucking brilliant work and so hard to do because that's deconstructing the world as we know it to actually look at how we are creating it.
Yes. And to recognize who is authoring it. So who
is authoring it?
As another example, I'm a mom. My husband and I both work, but I'm the primary breadwinner. And I have a lot of ideas about what my house should look like and the quality of the food that my kids should eat and so on and so forth. Standards, which I've worked hard to relax. But
I mean, also just putting out there, you did kind of build Goop up. So I feel like you spent a lot of time researching that shit. So
I did.
Just so we're clear.
I've also come to realize that that being highly neurotic about things can be more harmful to your health, I think, than just being a little bit more relaxed and reasonable.
The rigidity doesn't make you digest the food better.
Any better. No.
No, certainly it makes it worse.
I think it makes it worse. But so a couple of years ago, I fell off a horse and I broke my neck. And I was fine, Scott. I didn't even realize that my neck was broken for a week, but I'm very lucky. And after I realized it was broken, I'm the child of a doctor. So of course I'm diagnosing myself. I'm like, I'm not nauseous. I don't have a headache. I didn't have a bad concussion, etc. Don't do this at home. Just go and get a CT scan and an MRI like a normal person. Anyway, I end up in a neck brace for 6 weeks. I'm not allowed to lift anything. And I was in pain, so I wasn't lifting much anyway. Not allowed to lift anything, not allowed to drive. I couldn't really clean, cook, do laundry. And I could balance my laptop on my knees and type and read. But I was mostly couch bound. And it was such an interesting experience for me because the anxiety that I felt about not being able to participate in daily life was so overwhelming. And it's not because anybody was insisting that I do it. And I was so confronting because I realized that all the anger and resentment that I've been holding at my quote unquote husband for all the work that I do to make sure our house is really clean and all the laundry is always done and everyone's eating really well is all self-imposed and or part of a larger culture that insists that mothering looks a certain way. My husband was not hustling me about the nutritional contents of dinner or barking at me that I needed to sweep. None of it comes from him. It is all me. And it's cultural.
Yeah.
It's cultural. This is shocking to me.
Yeah. I mean... it's so nuanced because sometimes we do meet the people who not only we create it's that sibling transference thing I was talking about either. Sometimes I'm creating the environment that someone steps into or the conditions that step into to confirm it. They'll leave me. Well, I keep pushing them away and then they leave me. But they also might have the tendency innately to be more on the avoidance spectrum and leave people and just toss them away like yesterday's trash. So it's nuanced in that way. Or Sometimes we're not even creating the conditions as much, but we find the people that help really replicate the familiar.
Of course.
Or reaffirm.
Reaffirm 100%. We love our stories.
Oh my God, we love our stories. I grew up feeling so dumb and such a burden to the world based on my family history. And I dated someone who had no problem affirming that, who would actually tell me I'm a burden, who would tell me I'm unlovable. And it was like all of these things. And I was like, oh my gosh, or like there was something in me that was just like, I know this is wrong, but something in me was like,
this feels good.
This feels familiar enough. Yeah. It's almost a validation that I was like, you're right. How can I be a better person? Not, now that I'm way out of it, I'm like, oh, wait, I am innately good. I am innately smart. And I had to really go back and not blame him, but look at what part of me would feel validated and really work on that so that I will never be with someone again seeking that level of validation or confirmation.
Yeah. Isn't it so interesting?
So interesting.
Yeah. But sometimes like that is what you need. You have to like walk into the wall in order to go a different direction or to experience enough cognitive dissonance where you're like, whoa. Actually, I choose something else.
Yeah.
New movie.
New movie. Thank you for bringing back the cat reference of walking into the wall. Well done. Well done. I mean, and it's true. I want to talk about now, like, okay, we've been unpacking the science and the psychology of these ways we replicate, that we find ourselves in systems that we, internalize and then externalize and then internalize the externalization. How the fuck do we stop it? How do we walk into that wall hard enough to be like, I want out of the matrix?
Yes. Well, part of it, I think it's just awakening. It's a new consciousness. It's seeing, it goes back to the beginning of our conversation, seeing what you're up to and taking responsibility for doing something else. So I'll give you an easy example. And this definitely relates to women. You can tell me whether you relate to it as well. But the chapter on envy is probably the chapter that gets the most resonance when I go out and talk about the book. All women want to bring it back to envy. It's sort of the gateway drug to the other sins. And it is this idea, envy. I think we hear that word and we're like, ooh, gross. Like, ooh, no, I don't ever have any envy, right?
It's self-criticism, as I recall.
Well, envy shows you what you want. You are envious towards someone who has something or is doing something that you want. It's very intimate. And it's essentially about projection.
Yeah.
And that person is doing something that you might not think that you would ever allow yourself to do, that you couldn't get away with, etc. And so the instinct, particularly for women, and this plays into scarcity and this idea that there can really only be one woman. And if she has it or she's doing it, that I can't also have it. None of this is conscious, by the way. But our instinct is when someone is doing something or has something that we want is to project and destroy them, deprecate them, put them back in their place, take them down a notch, cut off their head. And we do this, women do this all the time. And men might participate in it, but it's something I've really observed with women. And you see it very visibly in our culture. Again, it goes back to reputational harm. There are lots of ways to take a woman down or put her back in her place, but we do it to famous women all the time. Blake Lively is the most recent example.
I don't, because I'm not on any socials or watch the news. What happened to Blake? She was the gossip girl?
Gossip girl.
Okay.
Oh, this is actually like a psychologically fascinating example, Scott, because it's two people, well, it's now implicated a lot more people who are we have a man who's very protective of his identity as being a hero to all women, Justin Baldoni, who is the director in this movie that Blake Lively was in, that's about domestic violence. Essentially what happened is they made a movie together. As it came out, Blake, quote unquote, sort of subtly, but very obviously made it clear that she did not like Justin and that there was something happening. Like everyone unfollowed him on social media. He was disinvited from the premiere. She wouldn't stand in a photograph with him. so she sort of quietly set off a bomb, and then the internet did its thing.
As it
and
does.
And then it was like, was he sexually harassing her? Oh no, she was like horrible to work with. And she got destroyed / canceled. Then it came out right before Christmas that he had been involved with his PR in some sort of crisis comms, surreptitious takedown. And then it sort of swung back towards him. Then he countersued the New York Times, who published this story about this crisis comms cancellation of Blake Lively, and released all of his texts, which then, of course, make it all more complicated because it's like, she's being shitty. It's unclear what he was doing. He was probably being really shitty too. Anyway, everyone looks terrible, but it's interesting. What was most interesting about it was that watching the takedown of her catch incredible speed very quickly. Like, we love to destroy a woman. And every famous one, I write about Anne Hathaway as she gets taken down, right? As Jennifer Lawrence, as she was like on the ascent, and we just like couldn't get enough of her. And then we decided she'd had enough, and then we destroyed her. And it's just this playbook for all women. Free Britney. But it's really, I think, driven also of envy, of like, who does she think she is? How dare she? I would never allow myself to do that. And so until women become conscious that this is sort of this repetition compulsion that we're doing and creating this playbook of what happens to visible women, we'll never have more power if we can't allow each other to have power without trying to destroy each other.
Yeah. This is like the rise and the takedown of like girl boss, right?
And let me be clear, nobody should be canceled. It's like an inhuman response that allows no restorative justice, no opportunity to model making mistakes and doing things differently. It's like, but it is so exceptionally cruel to women. There's I don't know if you're aware of this either, and this probably won't, we'll see if there's any traction or what happens here. But I mean, you might have followed the Andrew Huberman New York Magazine story where he was having like consecutive simultaneous relationships with many women. And it was not a good story and a terrible look. And I have my own concerns about Andrew Huberman and men of that ilk who don't ever interview or platform women. It's like at that point, I think he'd interviewed 8 women. So anyway, I have my own written Substack series about this, like what it means that we idolize these men who don't make any appropriate room for women. They cite their research all the time, but they don't interview them. So you'll see like Peter Attia and Andrew Huberman interviewing each other about menopause. It's like, bros, Attia, you're not a board certified doctor who focuses on longevity. Very smart, of course. Huberman, you are a PhD focused on the optical nerve. Like, interview some experts, interview some women. Come on, you have huge platforms. Anyway, but Huberman got through that without acknowledging any harm, and nobody cared, and he gained followers, and here we are. He's as prominent and powerful as he was before in terms of telling people how to live their lives. I do want us to be able to talk about some of this stuff culturally in a way that's much more productive. Like, here's how we do this. This is a way to make this right. And speaking of scarcity for women, there's a way for all boats to rise. And building off each other's work is what we do, and we credit each other.
Yeah. I think when there's a scarcity of resources, I know. When there's a scarcity of resources in any minority group, which there are many, then there becomes that infighting, which is just as painful, because the infighting is really about the fight over resources.
Including attention.
Including attention. It's funny. I think I've said this before. There was a whole section in my book on that, and this infighting for attention and and resources, and it got taken out because it was considered it could create I don't know. The publishers thought it might make me look really bad because infighting between minority groups or like, you know, and I was like, what world are we talking about? Like, you know, what are we talking about that we actually think that unpacking this material that is creating perpetual harm within ourselves and other people, not relevant?
Yeah.
But anyways, I digress.
Next book.
Well, next book is pretty different. But yeah, Awareness is helpful, but it doesn't necessarily just elicit or create the new neural pathways.
Mm-mm.
And so like we run into the wall, we go, oh my God, maybe I'm perpetuating my own, you know, harm to myself or other people, or like these systems are actually causing me to feel less free in my life. And yet these systems aren't going to go away just on their own. So how do I create more choice and agency within the existing systems?
Yeah. I think, I mean, and I would be very interested for your perspective as a therapist and coach, that the first step is awareness. Mm-hmm. And then the second step is sort of a self-therapizing or therapizing with other people about, and you did it previously in our conversation where you were like, okay, I just want to pause and have so people can process how they're feeling. So a lot of it is that, like, I'm feeling, so when I talk to women about envy, for example, and that instinct to sort of strike out and destroy another woman or deprecate her, whether it's a coworker or someone famous or your best friend, is, and I do this with some of my best friends all the time when we walk on the weekends, where I'm like, I'm having a big reaction. I'm having a lot of feelings about this person and this situation. And can you help me understand what's happening here? And even that process of saying, why is this person bugging the shit out of me? What is she doing that I won't allow myself to do? What does she have that I might want? Has been,
so back to envy
has been the most clarifying work that I can do with myself. And I've been doing it for years now, and with friends, and pausing them and saying, okay, wait, stop. What's happening? Let's talk about this. Like what's really, when we're going off and we're bitching about a friend of ours who is like, has started a Substack and is like being really self-aggrandizing and really sort of look at me. What's going on? It's that part of me that would never allow myself to do that. It's the part of me that's like, I don't want anyone to think I'm looking for attention. How can she be so brazen about it? How can she be so big about it? That's what's being activated. It's nothing that she's doing. So the more I think we get better at saying, why am I activated? What is this bringing up in me? How can I tend to that part of myself? What part of myself is feeling threatened? What part of myself is feeling unseen? What part of myself is feeling scared? What is happening? The more adept we become at, one, calming our own nervous systems down so we can see a bit more clearly that, no, the problem isn't her Substack. The problem is me. Yeah. But like, it shouldn't, you can tell the difference, because there's certain things that people do things and you're like, I don't give a shit. Like, why would I care about that? It's so far afield. You know, I don't want to fill a stadium and be a singer. Taylor Swift doesn't like make me feel anything. I'm not a Swiftie, but not because I don't like Taylor Swift. I just like, literally, I don't think I could name a Taylor Swift song. But for some women, people, she's very activating because she is living out their dream. Whereas I can see someone hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and be like, I didn't think that book was that good. And
yeah, I mean, envy really highlights where we already have a gap or a sense of deficit.
Yes. And what we want. It's what we want. That person's knocking on, that's your soul saying, pay attention to this. There is something here for you. Pay attention. I'm going to torment you. Tormentor you into seeing it.
So true. I mean, and that's a really helpful practice of like, when you feel the envy, what is it I want? Not what is it they're doing.
What is happening in me?
What is happening to me? I think one of the other elements, and you did this actually earlier, which I loved, which is when we got into that question of like, how would the world be different? And starting to even envision, okay, so I know I processed my feelings, I processed those parts of me, I processed that inner critic, I processed the young child in me that never felt seen and heard and loved. And so the fuel isn't there anymore for the behavioral patterns, or I process and realize that internalization that I have to be so thin to be pretty, to be loved, the things that we have internalized and adapted from a patriarchal system, I've unfueled it. I've given back that voice to the system and let go of the internalization of it. And then it's this dream state of going in the dream of how I and the world, it could be different. What would that look like? What would that feel like? And that starts to open up the new pathways of going, this is how I can be future forward.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And isn't that a beautiful idea? And I can't say I'm an expert at this, but I feel like just getting out of that sort of tight, constricted mode where you're reacting to the world as it comes at you and shifting into a place where you're like, hold on, like, what is my vision for myself? What do I want? What would feel good and loving? And then when we think about the world and this very turbulent moment that we find ourselves in of complete deconstruction, or feels that way, what is my higher vision for the world? And what can I hold, imagine? What do I want to see here? I think we're so good, Scott, at saying, I don't want that, and I don't want that, and I'm against that, and I'm against that. And meanwhile, it's like, well, what are we for? What are we for? And what are we for in our own lives? And what are we for in the wider world? And I think anything that gets us out of that polarized againstness and into that loving forness would be a better place to live. Or that's where I want to live. You can't live there all the time. Let's be real. But
I love
something
that
to aspire to.
Yeah. And I love that you're dreaming towards that and recognizing, okay, here are the things that create blocks to that dream.
Yeah.
Like, here's that voice that I've internalized, or here's that voice. Where did that come from? Whose voice is that tells me I'm not smart enough, or that I'm not pretty enough, or that I have to keep giving in order to receive love?
Yeah.
All of that. And once we start to recognize, oh, those are blocking the actualization of this dream.
Yeah.
It's such a healing process. I mean, that is the journey of healing.
Well, it's just so much more loving, which sounds like such a soft word, but I don't mean it as sort of a like trickly term. I mean that as a much more creative and powerful state. I mean, you mentioned wellness and that I played a role in wellness, which does fill me with some anxiety these days, not because I don't think, and again, it gets into this against and forness, where I look at movements like Maha and it gives me a tremendous amount of anxiety and pain. And the way that I see that is in the space of againstness, and that there are clear victims and villains and heroes, and it's not productive. Instead, it's like, I think we can all assume or hope or believe that we want a world that is healthier and healthy for children, and where people have access to the healthcare that they need and the support that they need, and that our environment is not being destroyed, and that we have whole foods that are readily accessible, and not just in Erewhon, but in food deserts across the country. All of these things, I think we could say, like, this is what we were for. This is our mission statement. These are our values as a culture. And 99.9% of people would say, I co-sign. That sounds like a beautiful thing. And instead, it's like, it's the farmers, it's pharmaceutical companies. I'm like, it's not that simple. I'm so grateful for so many life-saving pharmaceutical interventions, and farmers are the lifeblood of this country, and they're trying to survive, and all the things, Scott. But it's like, I don't think anyone's like, I'm going to try and poison a bunch of children today. No. So let's get 4 things. Let's get for ourselves. Let's start there. And for each other and for the world. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
Thank you for your TED Talk. It's actually, I love that. And I think it's a beautiful place to land with people, is like, I love that just that invitation. And I want you, if you're listening, to take that invitation and just, even for a day, try it out. See how it feels. See what changes in your internal and external ecosystem as you try it on. Let's fucking do it. Elise, it has been an absolute pleasure to deconstruct the constructs of our reality, patriarchy, late state capitalism, and all that jam with you, my love. Where can people find more of you in addition to buying your book?
I write a Substack called Pulling the Thread, and that's the name of my podcast. So podcast people, I have a podcast too. I love doing my podcast. I'm on Instagram at Elise Loehnen. Although who knows how long I'll be there, Scott. Like, I'm jealous that you're not on social media, and I would like to come off it. And yeah,
I'm on it. I just don't look at it.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
And then that's a good way to be too. And then my book is Honor Best Behavior, The 7 Deadly Sins and the Price Women Pay to Be Good. And there's a workbook coming this summer called Choosing Wholeness Over Goodness. Yeah.
Yes, please, wholeness.
Wholeness
is
the
all
good
the
and the
rage for
bad.
2025.
The good and the bad, friends. We're both.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And to all of our gently used humans out there, we love you. Thank you for listening to the Gently Used Human podcast with Dr. Scott Lyons and friends. Visit gentlyused.com for fun extras. And don't forget to spill the tea and gossip about the show with all your friends and frenemies. And show some love by giving us 5 stars and leaving a review in your favorite apps. This helps us connect with all the other gently used humans out there. Oh, and by the way, you look fierce today.